Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. In this video, we're going to go through building and playing Barbarians, two-handed fighting in particular. And we're going to go through a build which is free-to-play friendly, but to be honest, it's not too much different if you're paid either. Barbarians tend to be pretty similar regardless. Barbarian is an excellent class, one of the best melees at the moment for sure. They're incredibly strong, and they have huge survivability, high DPS, one of the best AoE insta-kills in the game, and super high tactics potential because of their high strength value. Let's talk about level split. So Barbarians, as you'll probably see if you've played DDO for any length of time, tend to stay pure. The reason they tend to stay pure is because the capstones are really, really good, both for Ravager and Frenzied Berserker. Ravager in particular is super popular for the capstone because it is an AoE insta-kill that's based on your Intimidate score, really easy to get a high DC in, and it just kind of stuff, you can just delete stuff around you. It's awesome. The Frenzied Berserker capstone is super good if you're just going out for an all-out maximizing DPS build. So whether you're doing that, Ravager or Frenzied Berserker, pure is what I recommend. It's not that you can't do other splits. You certainly can. There's a lot of other good splits, like 18-1-1's a very solid split as well that I see a lot. So it's up to you, but I think for most people, they're going to enjoy pure the most, and that's what we're going to go through in this build. Let's talk about starting stats. Two-handed fighting Barbarian can be built very simply by just focusing on strength and constitution. You basically max those out and that's it. However, in this build, I'm going to, instead of maxing con, I'm going to put 13 points into dex, so starting with 13 dex. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to recommend spring attack in this build. I just really like the spring attack line. It's a line of 3 feats. Spring attack's really useful for general movement and combat, for zerging, and for traversing things you need to traverse when platforming. So I really like it, but you can modify this build if you want to. If you're not a fan of spring attack, you can instead take stunning blow and then 2 other feats of your choice instead of the spring attack line, and you don't have to worry about taking dexterity. Also note that if you have dexterity tomes, you can adjust this build for your tomes, so you don't need 13 dexterity if you want spring attack right out the gate if you have tomes, because to meet the dex requirement for spring attack, you can factor in your tomes. That's really the only decision you need to make on this build. Do you want spring attack or not? Do you want stunning blow or not? Because the vast majority of feats for a Barbarian pick themselves. It's pretty obvious, particularly with a pure Barbarian, what feats you're going to take, and you don't see a lot of differences between one pure Barbarian build versus another pure Barbarian build. So they're very simple, straightforward for the most part. Let's talk about race. There's a lot of great options for race when it comes to Barbarian, and this depends completely on your personal preference and what you want your build to do. So I need to start by saying the footage you're seeing in this video is Razorclaw Shifter. The reason I was a Razorclaw Shifter for my recent Barb life is because I wanted the past life and I didn't want to use a +1 heart. And Razorclaw Shifter starts as a Barbarian, so that's why I played it. But I wouldn't recommend Razorclaw Shifter as an ideal race. It's just if you don't want to use a heart, you want to roll an iconic, you're going to be a Shifter. But what I would recommend, the most popular choice for Barbarians is half-orc. And half-orc is super, super, super good and synergizes amazingly well with Barbarian. It has the highest strength and the highest damage potential of all the races, and it gets some nice stuff in there like Lock Bash, which gives you the ability to open locked chests. Half-orc also has Orcish Rage action boosts and additional rage benefits in higher tiers. So half-orc is kind of tailor-made for Barbarian. That is its natural class. So if you have a lot of racial action points as well from racial reincarnations, it's extra good because you can afford to take all that stuff all the way to the top of the racial tree. So super, super good for both first life and multi-life TR characters, but definitely even better for those who have racial action points from racial reincarnation. Dwarf is a great option too. Dwarf gives you more hit points, damage, tactics bonuses. And I would say Dwarf is the single best option for Barbarian tank builds because they get the Radiant Force Field, known as Bubble in game colloquially by players. They get that Radiant Force Field Dragon Mark and the throw your weight around enhancement for con to damage as well. So you can have a really fun throw your weight around con Barbarian and just have just mountains of hit points. Human, I think, is a good choice as well, particularly for a first life character who's not going to have any extra racial points to put into their racial tree, or a free-to-play player especially. And it's also good if you want to hit, Human's good if you want to fit in both Stunning Blow and the Spring Attack line. Human's the only race that can do that because of that extra feat. Humans are never a bad choice as well. They get extra heal up and such. And it's really nice. A lot of people like going human because they get the D-Door Dragon mark as well. So that's really, really convenient. So human is a pretty good choice. I wouldn't say human's optimal, but it has a lot of interesting advantages if it fits what you're going for in your build. Warforged is a very underrated choice and a very interesting choice for a Barbarian, especially for a 1 to 20 life in particular. And the reason for that is, as constructs, they never become exhausted after raging, unlike all the fleshy races who fatigue after raging. Now, the fleshy races do become immune to fatigue after raging once they hit Barbarian level 17 and get Tireless Rage. But as a Warforged, you don't get that until Warforged gets it from level 1, whereas everyone else doesn't get that benefit until level 17, and they're stuck chugging a lesser restore pot after they rage every single time, which is a little annoying. So Warforged gets that nice convenience of not having to do that. Warforged also has a lot of immunities to CC effects, like including negative levels. They get extra hit points in damage, PRR, and 15 stacking melee power in their tree. So that's all also good. They get the flexibility of being able to be repaired in addition to being healed. So they have a lot of nice benefits and are really interesting. I think underrated choice for a Barbarian, but they aren't very popular because they do get that penalty to positive energy healing, which you can reduce but can't eliminate completely. It does go down to minus 20% to positive healing once you take full tiers of healers friend in their racial tree in that tier 1. But so you can never get rid of it, but you can reduce it, and it's not that big of a deal. As someone who plays a fighter, Kensei as their Warforged as their primary raiding character for raids, I will say that I don't really, it doesn't bother me much at all, and it's really not a big deal once you get to end game. Going on to other races, some of the elf races are good choices too for extra to hit and such, especially for 2-weapon fighting or single-weapon fighting barbarians. They get certain hit and damage with other weapon types. There's also Azamar, which works well. So you really have a wide variety, super wide variety of viable options depending on your preferences. Now let's go to alignment. Alignment, I would recommend chaotic neutral. You have to be chaotic as a barbarian. And in order to get the extra, actually, let me correct myself there. You have to be non-lawful, but you need to be chaotic in order to get, barbarians have to be non-lawful, but you have to be chaotic in order to get the extra 2 imbue dice from the Harbinger of Chaos feat, which we're going to take. And it's best to be neutral instead of good, in my opinion, in most circumstances, just so you're immune to all alignment-based damage that would harm a good character. Feats. So here's the feats you're seeing on the screen now. Everything here, other than Spring Attack, which we've already talked about, is self-explanatory. And two-handed fighting barbarians, as I alluded to before, really do build themselves, and there's really not a lot of flexibility in terms of what feats you choose, just because it's so obvious which ones you should take because you're going for max melee DPS. So let's just go through some of the feats I'll note. Two-handed fighting line, obviously. Power attack. Now, some of you might say, oh, what can I should take precision. You cannot take precision because you can't use precision while raging. And raging is, of course, a giant part of Barbarian and all the benefits they get. So you have to go power attack. Patience is clearly worth it on a high crit two-handed fighting build like a Barbarian. So patience you definitely want to take. Epic Barbarian DR I take later. It's slightly better than Epic DR because of that 1% Barbarian DR increase, which in addition to +5 PR and MR, which is better than just the flat 10 DR from the Epic DR feat, which was kind of the alternative I was considering at that level. Lastly, last feat, Titan's Blood is really good for this type of build, melee DPS, because there's nothing better to take here. It's tons of HP, and there's other better legendary hit point bonuses in the game, but they're on things like shields that you're not going to use because you're a DPS build. So definitely you want to take Titan's Blood. I just don't see a lot of other benefits to other feats. I mean, with some of these epic feats, they have a lot of the new feats available, which can give you benefits on tumble, things like that. But I think for most players, they would rather take what I'm selecting here. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Let's get into enhancements now. So here's the enhancements I put together for free to play, and I'll also put right here now what I used. So there is a little bit of difference if you're free to play versus if you're not, because if you are free to play, you're not going to have access to the Vistani tree to get haste boost. So that's the main difference. On the paid one, if you own that tree, then it's worth splashing Vistani. But if you don't own Vistani, then you won't. And you also, if you're free to play, you're not going to have access to a trance. Whereas if you are not free to play, you can actually take a trance, because Barbarian does not get a trance in any of their class trees. So if you're pure and free to play, you won't have access to a trance, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to their enhancements generally, you have to decide what tier 5 you want. Do you want Frenzied Berserker or do you want Ravager? So Frenzied Berserker, and also what capstone you want. As we talked a little bit about before, Frenzied Berserker has the most DPS potential, and much of that is because of the capstone and the higher crit multiplier from both Death Frenzy and the +2 crit multiplier in the tier 5, and that makes it synergize. I would note also, it makes it synergize really well with Adrenaline and Epics. Ravager is by far the most popular over Frenzied Berserker from my experience, and the reason is because in addition to that capstone, that insta-kill capstone, Ravager gets excellent self-healing. They get a really, really powerful healing that hits you for heals when you get hit or when you make a kill, and you can see descriptions of that in the different enhancements in the tree, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then they also get that AoE insta-kill. Occult Slayer, it is the Barb tank tree. I know I haven't mentioned it until just now. You probably aren't going to use it, aside from maybe a small splash for longer rages, which I think is the main thing that's attractive as far as low-hanging fruit. But the reason for that is the other trees are just better options for most Barbarians, in my opinion, unless you're going for a Barbarian tank. Barbarians are already very tanky, so I wouldn't recommend putting much in Occult Slayer unless you're looking to go for that tanky play style. It is worth noting, though, Occult Slayer still gets a lot of DPS stuff. It's not like Sacred Defender or something where that's all defense. They do still get DPS stuff in the tree, so any Barbarian is going to be able to DPS. So generally so I guess if I had to summarize this into generalities, if you're raiding, you probably want to go Frenzied Berserker, or if you just want top single target DPS output, you probably want to go Frenzied Berserker. That's what you do. If you're in any other situation, whether you're leveling or you're soloing, it's probably better to go Ravager for both that AoE insta-kill and the self-healing, because you're not going to be in that raid environment where you're going to have a healer and where single target DPS matters so much. So you're going to see most Barbarians use tier 5 Ravager, and especially in Heroics, I think pretty much all Barbarians are going to want to use Ravager while leveling, because you don't have alternate ways to heal as a Barbarian until you get into Epics, and you can use the Primal Scream from the Fury of the Wild Epic Destiny for healing. So I think in Heroics especially, from 1 to 20, you probably want to go Ravager and get that healing. There's also a lot of personal preference in how much do you take in the half-orc tree and how much do you take in your secondary class tree. Any Barbarian's going to go obviously tier 5 in their main tree, so it really comes down to how high do you want to go in your second class tree, and how high do you want to go in your racial tree. So here, for a first lifer, I weighed more towards having Death Frenzy over having, say, like Rage and Crush and some of the other higher tiered stuff in the half-orc tree. Preferably, if you have a bunch of racial past lives, you can kind of take everything. But if you don't, you are going to have to make that judgment for yourself. And I would recommend you kind of play around with some of that stuff. And just you can always reset your enhancements, so don't feel like you have to only be locked into one thing. I will say that I think some of the half-orc enhancements, like Raging Crush, falls off a little bit in Epics, just because you do have alternate sources of that, primarily Adrenaline. So having two versions of that, with the racial version being automatic crit version being on a much longer cooldown, kind of makes it a little redundant. But it would still be great to have, but it's just not as critical maybe as during Heroics. Some notable Ravager enhancements to get into some more specifics. I would say the capstone, we don't need to talk about that, we've already talked about it. But I would say, as a side note, it has one major drawback, which it does not work on anything immune to fear. So say like undead. And it also can only kill a max of 6 enemies each use. But because it's based on your Intimidate score plus a 1d20, it is really easy to get a high DC, little gearing required. So other Ravager enhancements that are notable: temporary HP from I Like Pain. Cruel Cutter is helpful in Heroics as it does con damage, which can make mobs helpless. And it'll do that pretty easily in heroics, as it'll reduce their con to 0. So if your con gets to 0, you become helpless. So you can do this to enemies too. I did find that this tends to fall off in epics. When I'm in epics, I'm not seeing enemies become helpless from Quick Cutter. Other notable enhancements from Ravager: Laughter and Dismember for melee power, Blood Strength in Tier 5 for self-healing, Critical Rage in Tier 5 for +2 crit range. Let's get to Frenzied Berserker, some specific ones I want to note here. Death Frenzy in the cores, be aware of that, try to get it. It's a lot of extra crit multi, imbue dice, and strength, so spam that. It doesn't have a cost, you can just continually spam it and have it up all the time. So if you take that enhancement, make sure you do that. Storm's Eye, the Frenzied Berserker, we haven't talked specifically about that one yet, but it's awesome. You get 25 stacks of +1 damage for each stack. So it's a lot of extra damage, especially when you get into epics. You can have Storm's Eye, and then you can use Adrenaline, and then you can use Boulder's Might, and this stuff all has a multiplicative effect to give you giant crits. It's really, really fun. Blood Tribute is worth noting here. It's temporary HP that takes a little bit of your con away until you rest, but it's really nice particularly in like high skulls, because you won't have great self-healing, but you can still use this for temporary hit points during fights, because obviously if you're running R10 or something, you can't just self-heal with the Fury heal. It's not gonna work very well because of the self-heal penalty, but you can use Blood Tribute to give you a bunch of extra temporary hit points. So this is an enhancement that varies a lot depending on what difficulty you're running. If you're not running high skull stuff, you may not even want to take it if you're just running, say, like R1 or Epic Elite, because you probably won't need it. It's more something that's super good to counteract the Reaper healing penalty. Other ones I want to note: Tantrum is a cleave that gives you 50% chance for all enemies to receive a trip that is considered helpless. So it's a really nice way to get helplessness on a Frenzied Berserker. And yeah, it's just great for a little bit of crowd control as well. Focus Wrath, +2 crit multiplier, which is the big thing that gives Frenzied Berserker those giant crits. They get the +2 crit multi as compared to Ravager, who just gets +2 crit range, which is still awesome, but it's not going to give you the huge crits. It's just going to make you crit more often. And when you get into the huge crit multipliers, that's the stuff that really helps when you get to epics and you start using Adrenaline, because it has that extra multiplicative effect. Adrenaline stacked with all these other things. Let's get into skills now. Skills, pretty basic. Intimidate, you want to take Intimidate even if you're not a tank, because the Ravager enhancement, right? The Ravager enhancement works based on your Intimidate score, so make sure you take Intimidate. Also, Lock Bash, if half-orc, works based on your Intimidate score, so that's another reason to take Intimidate. As far as a secondary skill, I mean, this is my personal preference, I always take UMD, so that's what I recommend here, because it's just so convenient. Teleport scrolls, you can use Raise Dead scrolls to raise party members, among other things. It's just really nice. GH scrolls, whatever you might need. It's worth noting that as a Barbarian, when you're raging, you cannot use scrolls, but you can always use the Dismiss Rage button and then just rage again. So it's really not a problem if one of your party members dies and you need to use a Raise Dead scroll. It's fine. Don't worry about it. You get tons of rages as a Barbarian, so it's not like you're going to run out. It's not a problem. Let's get into Epic Destinies. This, what you're seeing on the screen, is what I use for leveling. It can change when I'm at cap. A couple things to know with Epic Destinies. We need to talk about Quick Cutter versus Adrenaline. Quick Cutter being the big cleave, damaging cleave, and Adrenaline being the big single target damage effect from, or ability from, Fury of the Wild. So Quick Cutter is clearly the way to go for leveling, or if you just want to play like high skull 6-man quests and in-game, but we're just really not just high skull, just any difficulty, because it gives you that amazing AoE. But Adrenaline, I would say, is the way to go if you want to be a raiding character and stay at in-game. And that's because it gives much better single target DPS over Quick Cutter. So take Adrenaline if you are just beating on rage bosses. That really, really helps you catch up a bit with some of these fighting styles that are better for single target damage. Generally, you can still get those giant crits, so it's really, really good for those raid bosses, especially if you're Frenzied Berserker. So Fury of the Wild, let's go through and talk about the specific trees. Fury of the Wild is just obvious. It's obviously the best main tree for your Barbarian. It gives you needed self-healing through tier 4 with Primal Scream as well, which is a huge benefit. I don't really need to talk about Free of the Wild. It's pretty obvious just that it is the best. The tier 5 is just tons of synergy with Barbarian because we get the feats and Wilderness Lore to get all the extra bonuses that are included. Let's talk about Grandmaster Flowers. So I use Grandmaster Flowers when leveling, especially for extra speed and the extra 1W, so 1 weapon damage. It's slightly better than Fury Mantle when leveling, and we don't have a helplessness source, so all the helplessness damage is not really going to help a lot from Fury, though if you are Frenzied Berserker, you do get the cleave, I guess, but if you're a Ravager, you're not going to have a helplessness source, so yeah, that's why I go Grandmaster Flowers. It makes I like being faster. Faster is fun. You could swap into using the Fury if you later, when you get to cap, maybe you're raiding and stuff, or maybe you have people in your party who are constantly doing holds or dragon lords that are doing dragon's roar or whatever, and there's a lot of stuff helpless all the time, then maybe there's a lot of disco balls, whatever, you could take the Fury of the Wild mantle instead if you want. Dreadnought, finally, for the secondary tree. Lots of extra attack damage, action boosts in that tree, so that's primarily why I did that. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about gear. I didn't stay at Cav long term, so I don't have a specific optimal gear set for you guys. But in general, I can't talk generally about things you want to look for. Barbarian's very simple to build. That you're a simple character. You're going all for melee DPS. So get as much strength, double strike, melee power, intimidate, seeker, deadly, accuracy, fort bypass as you can, just to name some of the things you want. But that's I think I've got the primary ones covered. Deception, improved deception. Get the enhanced blood rage proc. It's so good. Get it on something. Relentless fury as well, really good. And get anything that gives you extra rage bonuses. Make sure you get some heal amp in your gear set as well. You have tons of HP, so this benefits you greatly. You want to make sure that when someone heals you, that you are healing fully. That's just really great for general survivability, particularly if you're grouping. Make sure you're stacking multiple set bonuses if you're at endgame to get both artifact and profane bonuses to areas like melee power, strength, fort bypass, and double strike. These areas that really, really matter. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you for the next video. So I want to say, finally, thank you to my Patreon supporters, Brian Rasmussen and Brent Erickson. Really appreciate the support. You all have a good one. I'll see you next time. Take care.